Hello, everyone. Welcome to Readings in English, where we dive into stories that not only entertain, but also help you learn and connect with the English language. Whether you're a beginner or looking to improve your fluency, our channel brings you carefully chosen stories that are not only enjoyable, but also rich with vocabulary and expressions that you can use in everyday life. Learning English can feel like opening a door to a new world. It's a language spoken around the globe, connecting people from different cultures and backgrounds. English allows us to share ideas, tell our stories, and understand the world from new perspectives. Through stories, English becomes more than just words and grammar. It becomes a bridge that connects us. Today, I'm excited to share a story called The Lost Translation. It's an emotional journey about a Spanish artist named Carmen who travels to New York to share her artwork with the world. But she faces a big challenge, expressing her deep personal emotions in a language she barely knows. This story follows her struggle to connect through art and language, and her journey teaches us about courage, resilience, and the power of finding our own voice. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the world of The Lost Translation together. Enjoy the journey, and maybe you'll find a little inspiration to help you along your own path in learning English. Carmen Garcia moved her fingers along the edges of the invitation, her eyes reading each line again. An invitation to New York to show her art to a wider international audience. It was everything she dreamed of since her early days as an artist in her small studio in Seville. She had struggled to gain recognition in Spain, working day and night to create art that reflected her soul, and now, finally, the world was taking notice. The gallery hosting her show was in Manhattan, a world away from her quiet Spanish hometown. The curator, a renowned figure in the art world, had praised her work as emotionally raw and uniquely expressive, qualities Carmen had strived to embody in every piece. She felt the thrill of validation, that sense of fulfillment that had often eluded her. Yet, as she read the invitation again, a creeping doubt began to settle in. Carmen's English was passable. She could understand basic sentences and respond, though her speech felt stilted. She'd never had to explain the meaning of her art in English, and she wasn't sure she could convey the depth of her vision. Would her paintings, with all their intricate emotions and personal history, make sense to people who didn't share her language or her background? She wondered if the rawness she was known for would translate across continents, across languages. She brushed away her doubts, reminding herself that this was the chance she had longed for. She would adapt, she told herself. She'd learn to find the words. The flight to New York was a blur of nervous energy and quiet determination. When the plane landed, Carmen felt her heart swell as she looked out at the New York skyline. The towering buildings seemed to shimmer in the early morning light, and the sheer size of the city was overwhelming. She took a deep breath, adjusting to the hum of life all around her. As she stepped into the gallery later that afternoon, Carmen felt the magnitude of her surroundings. The walls were pristine, ready for her pieces, which had been shipped days earlier. Her paintings would soon hang here, capturing the attention of critics, collectors, and art lovers alike. It felt surreal. Carmen watched as the gallery staff carefully arranged her paintings, each piece treated with meticulous care. She appreciated the professional atmosphere, but her mind was already racing, rehearsing the phrases she'd prepared for when people asked her about her work. She had memorized the descriptions of her paintings in English, hoping they would be enough to explain her art. On opening night, the gallery buzzed with the presence of New York's elite. Critics, collectors, and fellow artists mingled, their voices blending into a soft murmur that contrasted sharply with Carmen's silent anxiety. She tried to catch snippets of conversation, picking up fragments of English she barely understood, feeling her confidence waver. Then the inevitable happened. A well-dressed woman approached, her smile warm but curious, her eyes scanning Carmen's painting. "Your work, it's haunting. Can you tell me more about the story behind this piece?" The woman's words were kind, but the vocabulary was more sophisticated than Carmen was prepared for. She hesitated, the practiced sentences fading in her mind. "It's about the memory of my past," Carmen managed, her accent thick, her voice small. She could see the woman's polite smile falter as her attempt at explanation fell short. A few more people approached with similar questions, each conversation leaving Carmen feeling exposed, as though her lack of English diminished her art. A prominent critic, known for his directness, examined one of her larger pieces of painting that depicted a woman, her face obscured by shadows, symbolizing hidden pain. "There's something inaccessible about this," he commented to his companion. "It feels as if the artist is hiding something." Carmen overheard and felt the sting of the words. She wanted to scream, to tell him that the painting was not about hiding, but revealing, about stripping bare the deepest fears and vulnerabilities. But her English couldn't capture that complexity. The words stayed lodged in her throat, and she felt a growing sense of alienation. The evening continued, and while her paintings received attention, Carmen felt like a spectator at her own event, standing on the sidelines of her dream, just out of reach. At last, the crowd began to thin. She slipped out of the gallery into the brisk New York night. Alone on the bustling street, Carmen felt the weight of her doubts resurface. She wanted this opportunity, but not at the cost of feeling like a stranger to her own work. She had come to New York hoping her art would speak for her. Instead, she felt more disconnected than ever. The following days brought Carmen a mix of exhilaration and frustration. While her art show had received praise in local newspapers, and she saw new faces marvel at her paintings each day, her interactions with visitors left her feeling hollow. Each time someone asked about her work, she struggled to explain. Words felt inadequate, foreign, as though she were trying to capture emotions in a language that could never hold them. On the third day of the exhibit, a well-known art critic visited the gallery. Carmen noticed him almost immediately dressed in a sleek suit. With a notebook in hand, he examined each piece with a scrutiny that made her palms sweat. When he reached her signature work, a painting she had titled Sombra del Alma, Shadow of the Soul, she held her breath. "I've read about your piece in the papers," he said, glancing at her before focusing back on the painting. "I sense a dark, almost hidden quality here. But tell me, what does it truly mean?" Carmen's heart pounded as she tried to muster a response. She opened her mouth, only to feel the weight of her limitations pressing down, as though an invisible barrier stood between her thoughts and his understanding. "It's about," she struggled, looking at the canvas as though it might supply her with the right words. "It shows, a deep feeling. A sadness, hard to say." The critic's eyes grew more impassive as her words faltered, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded, his notebook closed, and with a faint smile, he moved on to the next piece. Carmen felt the frustration rise within her, wishing she could tell him what Sombra del Alma truly meant, the memories and emotions it held, but the words stayed unspoken. That night, as she wandered the city streets alone, Carmen realized she needed help if she was to convey her art to an English-speaking audience. Her paintings held stories, memories, layers that no one seemed able to grasp, not because they lacked substance, but because she lacked the language to reveal them. Just then, she noticed a small, dimly lit cafe, with a modest sign reading Literary Cafe. She peeked through the window and saw a man hunched over a book, his focus intense yet calm. Something about the place felt inviting, grounding her amidst the cacophony of the city. She stepped inside, hoping to gather her thoughts over a warm drink. Inside the cafe, Carmen was greeted by the smell of coffee mingling with the faint, comforting scent of old books. The place was quaint, with shelves filled with well-worn novels and poetry collections. The man she had noticed earlier glanced up, offering a friendly nod before returning to his book. Taking a seat in a quiet corner, Carmen sipped her coffee, feeling the warmth soothe her nerves. As she sat, lost in thought, she overheard fragments of the man's conversation with the barista. He spoke with an ease and rhythm that reminded her of her own professors back in Seville. He seemed to know everyone in the cafe, exchanging warm greetings and offering book recommendations to the patrons. Curiosity stirred within her, and before she realized it, she had approached him. "Excuse me," she began, hesitant but determined. "I am an artist, but my English is not so good. I need help explaining my art." The man looked up, his gaze warm and understanding. "Ah, I see," he replied, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "My name is Thomas. I teach English and literature Maybe I can help." Carmen smiled, relieved. "I am Carmen. I have art show, but I feel lost. I want people to understand me, but I don't have words." Thomas listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Language is just another form of art," he said gently. "The words may be new to you, but the feelings behind them are universal. Maybe we could start with something familiar to you. Do you like literature?" Carmen hesitated, nodding slowly. "Yes, but I know only Spanish writers. I know Garcia Lorca, some poets." "Perfect," he replied, his smile growing. "I have an idea. If you're open to it, I could teach you English through stories and poems. It may feel a bit unusual, but sometimes stories hold truths that formal lessons cannot." Intrigued, Carmen agreed. Over the next few days, they met regularly at the cafe, and Thomas introduced her to stories from English literature. Each lesson involved reading passages, discussing their meanings, and drawing parallels to her artwork. It was challenging, but Carmen felt herself opening up to the language in a way she hadn't expected. The words began to carry weight, connecting to her own feelings, her own art. One afternoon, after a particularly intense discussion on a passage from The Great Gatsby, Carmen felt something shift within her. She understood the character's longing, his search for meaning, a feeling that mirrored her own journey. Thomas noticed her pensive silence. "You see, Carmen, language is not just vocabulary. It's emotion, memory, experience. When you connect with it, English becomes part of you, just as your art is." Carmen left the cafe that day with a renewed sense of hope. Perhaps with Thomas's guidance, she could find a voice that transcended language barriers, and perhaps, in doing so, she could finally share the true depth of her art. Carmen's lessons with Thomas began to take on a rhythm that felt like music, each session unlocking another part of the language, another layer of her own expression. They would meet in the quiet of the literary cafe, where Thomas would pull out a well-worn book and choose a passage for them to read together. Sometimes he picked classics, other times poetry, always focusing on pieces that spoke to human experience, love, loss, ambition, and resilience. On a chilly afternoon, Thomas brought a passage from To Kill a Mockingbird. He read aloud, his voice low but clear, bringing the words to life in a way that made Carmen sit up, fully engaged. She followed along, her fingers tracing each word, as she worked to understand the story's themes of justice and empathy. When they finished, Thomas looked at her expectantly. "What do you think, Carmen? How do you feel about the character Scout?" Carmen searched for words, tapping into the emotions that had stirred within her. "I think she sees the world with eyes pure," she said slowly, her accent thick but determined. "She does not judge, only tries to understand." Thomas nodded, impressed. "Exactly. Scout's innocence gives her a unique perspective, just as your perspective as an artist is unique. Imagine if you could share your own view of the world as Scout does. People wouldn't just see your art, they'd feel it." Carmen felt a wave of inspiration. The stories weren't just teaching her English. They were teaching her a new way of seeing herself. That evening, back in her small rented apartment, she took out her sketchbook and began drawing. Inspired by Scout's innocence and honesty, she poured her own emotions onto the page, sketching a young girl with questioning eyes, a reflection of herself, searching for connection in a foreign land. Her sketches transformed over the following days, each one evolving as her understanding deepened. She hadn't realized it before, but each English word she learned gave her art a new layer, a fresh way to communicate emotions she had struggled to put into words. It was as if the language itself was infusing her paintings with depth she hadn't known they lacked. As Carmen's artwork grew richer, her confidence began to blossom. With each lesson, she felt more attuned to the language, as though her brushstrokes and her newfound English vocabulary were becoming intertwined. She painted a new piece that was unlike any she had created before, a young girl standing at the edge of a vast forest, gazing into the unknown. The girl's eyes, wide with anticipation and curiosity, mirrored Carmen's own journey. Thomas, who had become not only her teacher, but a friend and mentor, stopped by the gallery to see the new piece. He stood in front of the painting, his head tilted in quiet appreciation. "It's beautiful," he said, turning to her with a warm smile. "This painting, it captures something powerful. I can see the influence of our conversations." Carmen's cheeks flushed with pride. "Thank you, Thomas. I feel like with English, I have new colors, new feelings to paint." Their connection deepened as they continued to explore literature together. Carmen began to read on her own between lessons, bringing passages to their meetings that resonated with her. One morning, she showed him a line from Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass that she found inspiring. The words, "I am large, I contain multitudes," struck a chord in her, a reminder that she could be both an artist and a learner, both a Spaniard and a resident of New York. For the first time, she felt she could bridge the gap between her Spanish soul and her desire to communicate in English. Then, one evening, Carmen presented her new painting at a small gathering of artists and patrons. She braced herself as visitors approached her, hoping that this time she could finally share her story in English. When a gallery visitor asked her about the painting, Carmen took a deep breath and explained, "This painting, it is about discovery. A journey, a search for belonging." The words felt natural, emerging from a place of honesty and vulnerability. She noticed the visitor's eyes light up with understanding, and for a moment, she felt truly seen. At the end of the night, Thomas approached her with a look of quiet pride. "You did wonderfully, Carmen," he said. "Tonight your art and your words spoke in harmony." For Carmen, this was the beginning of something extraordinary. She knew there was still a long way to go, but she was no longer afraid of the journey. With Thomas by her side, she felt ready to embrace the unknown, to continue discovering new shades of meaning in both her art and her language. The weeks went by, and as Carmen grew more familiar with English, her sense of accomplishment gave way to impatience. Though she had made progress, the language still felt elusive, like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Simple conversations were easier, but more complex discussions about her art remained a struggle. She often found herself pausing mid-sentence, searching for words that danced just out of reach. One evening, Carmen attended a larger exhibition event at the gallery, hoping to connect with influential art critics and patrons. The room buzzed with energy, and the sound of English conversations surrounded her, reminding her of just how far she still had to go. She greeted several visitors, exchanging pleasantries, but her usual excitement was dampened by a nagging self-doubt that refused to fade. As she wandered through the gallery, she overheard a critic speaking in hushed tones about one of her paintings. "It's compelling, but there's something missing," he said. "It feels as though the artist hasn't fully embraced her voice." Carmen's heart sank. The critic's words lingered, feeding her insecurities. She began to wonder if she would ever be able to convey the depth of her emotions in English, or if her art would always feel incomplete to those who didn't share her language. That night, she sat in her small apartment, staring at her sketchbook, feeling the weight of her own limitations. Frustration bubbled up, her fingers clenched around her pencil. She was tempted to give up, to return to Spain where her art spoke for itself, where she didn't need to bridge the chasm between her soul and her audience with words. But as the hours passed, Carmen found herself remembering Thomas's words about language and art being two sides of the same coin. She thought about the stories they had read together, the characters who'd struggled and triumphed, finding strength in their vulnerabilities. She thought about Scout, the young girl from To Kill a Mockingbird, and how her innocence had given her courage. A renewed determination took hold. This was her journey, and she would not turn back. The language barrier was simply another challenge, another layer to her artistry. She promised herself that she would keep pushing forward, no matter how difficult it became. Carmen resumed her lessons with Thomas with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer content with simply learning English. She wanted to understand it, to feel it in her bones. Thomas continued to guide her through stories that spoke to her, choosing tales of resilience, love, and identity. Each lesson felt like peeling back another layer of her own fears and insecurities. One afternoon, Thomas handed her a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, a story about a young man's search for meaning in a world that feels cold and indifferent. Carmen read slowly, savoring each line, feeling the protagonist's isolation and frustration. The story resonated with her, and she found herself connecting with the character's sense of not fully belonging. "I feel like Holden," she confessed to Thomas one day, after reading a particularly poignant passage, lost and not sure of where to go. Like a stranger, even in my own world, Thomas listened, his expression thoughtful. Holden's journey is one of self-discovery, just as yours is, he said gently. He's searching for truth, for a place to call his own, just as you're trying to find a way to express yourself in this new world. Carmen nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She realized that learning English was not only about explaining her art, but also about finding her own voice within it. Her paintings had always been a reflection of her inner world, but now they began to take on new shapes, new meanings, as she delved deeper into her understanding of language. Inspired, Carmen started working on a new series of paintings. This time, she allowed her experiences in New York to flow onto the canvas, the moments of isolation, the connections with strangers, the language lessons, and her growing self-awareness. She painted a series of abstract portraits, each one capturing a fragment of her journey. Faces emerged from the colors, some blurred, others clear, each one representing a part of her that was evolving. Her art became a diary of her transformation, and she poured her heart into every brushstroke. When she showed the first completed painting to Thomas, he looked at it in silence for a long moment, absorbing the vibrant colors and haunting expressions. "It's beautiful, Carmen," he finally said. "I can feel everything you've been through. It's as though the language is woven into the paint." Carmen's chest swelled with pride. She had discovered a way to communicate her journey without words, to let her art speak even when her English failed her. The portraits were a bridge, connecting her inner world to those who couldn't understand her language, but could feel the emotion in her brushstrokes. For the first time since arriving in New York, Carmen felt a sense of peace. She was learning, growing, finding her place in a world that had once felt foreign. And though there was still much to learn, she was no longer afraid. She was ready to embrace the journey, knowing that her art, her language, and her heart were all part of a single, evolving story. As Carmen's new series of paintings took shape, the gallery organized a private viewing to introduce her latest work to a select group of critics and collectors. This event was smaller, more intimate, allowing guests to connect personally with the artist. Carmen had prepared herself thoroughly, practicing English phrases that would help her explain the essence of her pieces. When the guests arrived, she was met with an encouraging response. Visitors gathered around her paintings, some murmuring in appreciation, others asking thoughtful questions. Carmen managed to hold short conversations, explaining her inspiration in English with carefully chosen words. She felt the first stirrings of confidence, as though her hard work with Thomas was finally paying off. But then a prominent critic, one whose opinion often swayed the public's view of new artists, approached. He examined her portrait of a faceless woman, a piece Carmen had poured her heart into, and tilted his head thoughtfully. "There's a certain depth here," he remarked, "but I wonder if the artist herself fully understands it. The work feels unresolved, as if she's struggling to articulate her vision." His comment struck Carmen deeply. She felt the familiar sensation of words escaping her, and in that moment, her English felt inadequate once again. She tried to explain the painting's meaning, but her sentences stumbled, her vocabulary too limited to capture the emotions embedded in her work. As she fumbled, the critic's expression shifted from mild interest to polite indifference. He moved on, leaving Carmen standing by her painting, feeling as though she had failed herself. A wave of frustration washed over her, tinged with embarrassment. This moment, which she had hoped would be a triumph, now felt like a reminder of her limitations. She wished she could vanish, escape the weight of her own perceived inadequacy. Later that night, as she returned to her apartment, Carmen sat alone, the city lights casting shadows on her walls. Doubts filled her mind, and she questioned her decision to come to New York to try and bridge the gap between her art and a language that still felt foreign. For the first time, she considered leaving it all behind, returning to Spain where her art was understood without explanation, yet a small voice within her resisted. She thought of Thomas, of the stories they had read together, of the characters who had faced struggles and emerged stronger. She couldn't give up now, not after all she had worked through. This setback was painful, but it was also a reminder of her journey and her growth. Determined, Carmen decided that she would push forward. She wouldn't let one critic's words define her worth or silence her voice. She would continue to learn, to paint, to share her art in ways that went beyond language. Carmen arrived at her next lesson with Thomas with a newfound intensity. She shared with him her experience at the gallery, her frustration, and not being able to express the depths of her paintings. Thomas listened, nodding, his eyes filled with understanding and compassion. "You're learning a new language and a new way of being understood," he said gently. "It's not easy, but every artist faces doubts. This is your journey, Carmen, and it's as important as the art itself." He handed her a small notebook. "I want you to write in English, even if it's difficult. Use simple words, whatever comes to mind, but capture the feelings behind your paintings. Don't think about grammar or vocabulary, just let the words flow." Carmen hesitated, but accepted the notebook. She began to fill its pages with fragmented sentences, capturing her thoughts and emotions, translating her inner world into English, however imperfectly. Writing became an outlet for her frustrations and her dreams, a place where she could explore her voice without judgment. In the weeks that followed, Carmen worked on her writing and her art simultaneously. The act of putting her feelings into words, no matter how limited her vocabulary, brought new clarity to her work. She found that the stories she created with her paintings grew richer, layered with the thoughts she penned in her notebook. One evening, Thomas suggested she give a talk at the gallery to share her journey with patrons and art lovers. Initially, the idea terrified her. Speaking in front of an audience in English felt overwhelming, but Thomas encouraged her to think of it not as a performance, but as an honest conversation about her art and her growth. Reluctantly, Carmen agreed. She spent days preparing, jotting down notes, practicing sentences aloud. Thomas sat with her, helping her refine her words, offering advice, and encouraging her at every step. His support gave her strength, reminding her that this was an opportunity to connect, not just to impress. When the night of the talk arrived, Carmen stood in front of a modest audience, clutching her notes. Her heart pounded as she looked out at the faces before her, each one waiting to hear her story. She took a deep breath, feeling Thomas's encouraging gaze from the front row. "Thank you for coming tonight," she began, her voice shaking slightly, but steadying as she continued. "I am Carmen Garcia, an artist from Spain. When I came here, I thought my art could speak for me. But I learned that art, like language, needs understanding." She shared her journey with them, from her initial excitement to her struggles with English, and how it had transformed her perspective. Though her words were simple, they were honest, and the audience listened intently. For the first time, Carmen felt that she was being understood not just as an artist, but as a person. As she finished, the room erupted in applause. Thomas beamed with pride, and Carmen felt a rush of relief and joy. She had shared her voice, however imperfect, and in that moment, she felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond words. The experience taught her that language, like art, was a journey of self-discovery. It didn't matter if her words were perfect, what mattered was that they were hers. In the days following her gallery talk, Carmen felt a newfound sense of calm. The fear of inadequacy that had haunted her since arriving in New York began to fade, replaced by the quiet confidence that her voice, though imperfect, had value. She continued her lessons with Thomas, not only learning English, but also deepening her understanding of herself and her art. One afternoon, as they sat together in the familiar comfort of the literary cafe, Thomas shared a story from his own life. He told her about his early years as a professor, the loneliness he had felt in the academic world, and how literature had been his refuge. His voice softened as he described how, through teaching, he had learned to connect with others, to find purpose in guiding students toward their own self-discovery. Carmen listened intently, surprised by this new vulnerability in her usually reserved mentor. She realized then that they shared more than just a love of language and art. They shared a journey of learning to belong in a world that sometimes felt distant and unfamiliar. Thomas had found his place through literature, and she was finding hers through the bridge between her art and English. You know, Carmen, he said thoughtfully, I think you've taught me as much as I've taught you. Watching you grow, seeing how you face each challenge, it's a reminder of why I chose to teach in the first place. The words struck Carmen deeply. She hadn't realized how much her journey had affected Thomas, just as his support had impacted her. For the first time, she felt that their connection went beyond teacher and student. It was a friendship grounded in mutual respect and understanding. That evening, as she walked home, Carmen reflected on the many layers of her experience in New York. Her journey had started with a desire to make her art understood, but it had evolved into something far greater. She was learning to accept herself, to value her own voice, and to see the beauty in her imperfections. And in doing so, she was discovering that language was not a barrier, but a bridge, one that could connect her to others in ways she hadn't imagined. Inspired by this revelation, Carmen began working on a new painting, one that symbolized her journey of self-discovery and growth. She envisioned a figure standing at the edge of a bridge, looking out toward an unknown horizon, the colors vibrant and full of life. As she painted, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that her art was now infused with a deeper understanding of herself and her purpose. As Carmen's painting neared completion, she felt a growing desire to share it with Thomas, to thank him for the role he had played in her journey. She invited him to her apartment, eager to reveal the piece that had become a visual diary of her transformation. When Thomas arrived, he stood quietly before the painting, absorbing the details, the vibrant colors, the figure on the bridge, the blend of hope and uncertainty that seemed to radiate from the canvas. Carmen watched him, her heart pounding as she awaited his reaction. It's breathtaking, Carmen, he said, his voice filled with admiration. I can see everything in this, the courage, the vulnerability, the journey. It's as if you've captured your entire experience here. She smiled, relieved and grateful. Thank you, Thomas. This painting, it's because of you, because of everything you've helped me discover. I couldn't have found this part of myself without you. They shared a quiet moment, the depth of their connection unspoken yet fully understood. In that moment, Carmen realized how much Thomas had come to mean to her, not only as a mentor, but as someone who had given her the courage to embrace her voice and her identity. Encouraged by his presence, she opened her notebook and showed him the entries she had written, the small fragments of English that captured her journey. Each sentence, though imperfect, was a reflection of her thoughts, her fears, her dreams. Thomas read through her words carefully, his expression a mix of pride and tenderness. These are beautiful, Carmen. They show so much of who you are. You've grown more than you realize. Feeling a surge of emotion, Carmen took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. Thank you, Thomas, for everything. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. It's been my honor, Carmen. Watching you grow, seeing how you've embraced your journey has reminded me of my own path, my own reasons for teaching. You've given me as much as I've given you. Their connection had evolved into something profound, a bond that went beyond words. For Carmen, it was a reminder that language, art, and friendship were intertwined, each one deepening her sense of belonging. As Thomas left that evening, Carmen felt a quiet sense of closure. She knew her journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more growth, but she was no longer afraid. With Thomas's support, she had discovered her own resilience, her own voice. Her heart felt full, her sense of purpose renewed. She was ready to continue her journey, not just as an artist, but as someone who had found her place in a world that once felt foreign. And in that quiet moment, she knew that her journey, with all its struggles and triumphs, had only just begun. As the months passed, Carmen's work continued to evolve. Her paintings, rich with her journey and newfound voice, began to draw attention, not only for their artistic quality, but for the deeply personal story woven into each canvas. Her reputation grew, and her gallery was now filled with visitors eager to see her art and understand the artist behind it. One afternoon, the gallery's curator approached her with a proposal. A well-known art magazine wanted to feature her story, how she had come from Spain, struggled to adapt to a new language, and used that experience to transform her art. It would be a major feature, complete with an interview and a full photo spread of her latest works. For Carmen, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. But as she sat down with the magazine's interviewer, she realized this would not be like her gallery talks. The questions went beyond the technical aspects of her work, delving into her personal journey, her doubts, her triumphs. The interviewer asked her how she defined success, and for a moment, Carmen hesitated, reflecting on her past expectations. When she first arrived in New York, success had meant one thing: having her art respected and understood regardless of language barriers. But now success felt like something different. She had found a voice in English, but more importantly, she had found a deeper understanding of herself, an acceptance of her own limitations and strengths. As she answered the interviewer, Carmen's words were simple but genuine. Success for me is about connection with myself, with my art, and with the people who see it. Language is part of that, but it's only a tool. True connection goes beyond words. The interviewer nodded thoughtfully, and for the first time in her journey, Carmen felt that her story was understood not just through her paintings, but through her words. She left the interview feeling a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that her definition of success was no longer tied to perfection or external approval, but to the honesty she brought to her work and her life. That evening, Carmen returned to her apartment, reflecting on everything she had gained since coming to New York. Her success was not only in her art, but in the relationships she had built, the connections that had shaped her journey. She felt a quiet peace, a sense of fulfillment that transcended the accolades and the praise. With renewed confidence, Carmen began planning her next series of paintings, each one a tribute to the different phases of her journey: the excitement, the struggle, the transformation, and the acceptance. This time, her work would not be a quest for validation, but a celebration of her own resilience and growth. The night of Carmen's latest gallery show arrived, and as she stood in the center of the room, surrounded by her paintings, she felt a calm certainty she had never experienced before. Each piece represented a chapter of her story, a glimpse into the emotions and lessons she had gathered along her journey in New York. Thomas was there, standing near the entrance, watching her with pride in his eyes. She knew that this moment was as much his triumph as hers, for he had been there at every step, guiding her, encouraging her, helping her to find the courage she needed to truly express herself. Throughout the night, visitors came to admire her work, and Carmen spoke to them with ease, her English flowing naturally, each word carrying the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. She no longer felt the need to prove herself. Instead, she allowed herself to simply be, sharing her art and her story with openness and joy. As the evening drew to a close, Carmen felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion. Her journey in New York had transformed her, not only as an artist, but as a person. She had discovered that true expression came from the heart, that language and art were only tools for conveying the deeper truths within. In a quiet moment, Thomas joined her, looking around the gallery with admiration. "You've come so far, Carmen," he said softly. "This is only the beginning for you," she smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't known was possible. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." "I couldn't have done this without you." They stood in silence, surrounded by her paintings, each one a testament to the journey they had shared. Carmen knew that while her time in New York might eventually end, the lessons she had learned here would stay with her forever. Her art, her language, and her heart had all grown, shaped by the struggles and triumphs of her journey. As she prepared to leave the gallery that night, Carmen took one last look at her paintings, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. She had found her voice, her place, her purpose. And with that realization, she walked out into the city, ready to embrace whatever new chapters awaited her, knowing that she would carry her story with her wherever she went. For Carmen, language was no longer a barrier, but a bridge between herself and the world, a bridge that she had built with resilience, creativity, and love.